You know those incredibly complex Rube Goldberg machines, like where a marble rolls down a ramp, knocks over a domino, which triggers a catapult, and then, eventually flips a switch on the other side of the room.
Oh, yeah, where you spend 5 minutes just watching a boot kick a bucket to, like, crack an egg or something?
Exactly.
Mm.
Well, today we are looking at the geopolitical equivalent of that exact mechanism. We have a stack of sources that, at first glance, I mean, they seem to come from totally different universes.
Right. On one hand, we've got a pretty sobering essay by Noah Smith. He's analyzing the escalating Iran war, the shifting global alliances, and the integration of artificial intelligence into live combat.
And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have financial reporting from the Economic Times, and that is detailing a bizarre and historic crash in global gold prices.
Which seems completely disconnected at first.
It really does. But the mission of this deep dive is to connect those dots for you. We're going to trace the invisible line that starts with, say, a drone strike in the Middle East, feeds into an AI targeting protocol, and sends a massive shockwave through global energy markets.
Right, which eventually dictates the value of the assets in your retirement portfolio or even just the price you pay at the local gas station.
Exactly. But before we pull the thread on how all these things are connected, I do want to set a quick ground rule. Because we are dealing with live geopolitical conflicts, domestic polling data, and the current U.S. administration's foreign policy, we are going to be touching on highly politically charged information.
Right, there are a lot of strong opinions out there on all sides.
Yeah, so our goal today isn't to take a political stance. We aren't here to endorse any administration's exit strategy or validate specific political viewpoints. We are purely looking at the raw data, the historical comparisons, and the financial arguments presented in these sources, just to understand the mechanics of what is actually happening.
Because analyzing the mechanics objectively is really the only way to make sense of the current volatility.
For sure. So to understand how an AI program impacts global inflation, we have to start at the epicenter of the disruption, and that is the current conflict involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Great.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading Noah Smith's essay, there is an undeniable undercurrent of anxiety. I mean, he poses a very heavy question. Are we in the foothills of World War III?
Yeah, that is a very loaded phrase.
It is. And I tend to push back on that kind of framing, honestly, because it feels like human nature to assume every major international conflict is the start of a global catastrophe. We always jump to the worst case scenario. I'm curious what makes this specific foothills comparison actually hold any analytical weight rather than just being, alarmist.
Well, Smith grounds that anxiety in a very specific and honestly often overlooked historical parallel. He points to the Battle of Khalkhin Gol in 1939.
Khalkhin Gol, I don't think I'm familiar with that one.
Most people aren't. It was this 4-month undeclared border war between the Soviet Union and Imperial Japan. And it happened before the official outbreak of the Second World War. But historians look back at it as a masterclass in foreshadowing.
Oh, okay. Like a precursor.
Exactly. It wasn't just a skirmish over territory. The USSR utilized a totally new, highly coordinated application of mass tanks under General Zhukov. They essentially tested the exact armored tactics and logistical strategies that would go on to define the massive global conflagration years later.
So they were basically using it as a laboratory.
Yes. And Smith's argument is that the current engagement with Iran is acting as our modern-day Khalkhin Gol. It is a live-fire testing ground.
Wow. And what's being tested isn't just the weaponry, it's the alliances themselves, right?
That's a huge part of it. The proxy conflicts act as a grim testing ground for global alliances.
Yeah. The essay points out that coalitions in what they're calling the Western theater are rapidly hardening into a unified front. So you have the U.S., Ukraine, Israel, and Europe acting in concert. And countering them, you have Russia and Iran. But the actual mechanics of how these countries are collaborating behind the scenes are wild.
They really are. We are seeing a complete reshaping of military infrastructure. According to the intelligence reports Smith cites, Russia is utilizing its highly sophisticated constellation of overhead satellites to feed Iran real-time telemetry.
Meaning they are actively helping Iranian forces locate and target American troops and naval vessels.
Exactly. They're pinpointing aircraft and ships.
Which is the exact mirror image of the dynamic in Eastern Europe, where the U.S. has been providing satellite intelligence to help Ukraine target Russian assets.
Right. And the reciprocal nature of these alliances is producing some incredibly pragmatic partnerships. Because Iran has been supplying Russia with Shahed strike drones for years, Ukraine has essentially been forced to become the world's leading authority on how to track intercept and destroy those specific Iranian drones.
And now the U.S. military is facing those exact same drones in the Middle East, and they desperately need that Ukrainian expertise. What stood out to me in the source material is that previously, the U.S. had actually rejected Ukraine's offers to help with anti-drone technology.
Yeah, they had turned them down.
But now, pure military necessity is overriding any bureaucratic or ideological hesitation. I mean, when your own radar installations are taking fire, you don't worry about protocol, right? You take the defensive algorithms from whoever has successfully survived the onslaught.
It demonstrates how quickly these proxy conflicts solidify alliances out of sheer survival. It's surprising that military necessity overrides ideological bias so fast. But while this Western theater is hardening, the essay is careful to note that the Eastern theater, specifically China and Taiwan, remains a massive, uncertain variable.
Right.
China is vocally criticizing American actions, but has deliberately kept its military out of the fray, choosing instead to just observe and learn.
They are watching how the game is played. Which brings us to the technology itself. Here's where it gets really interesting. If the 1939 battle at Khalkhin Gol was a preview of tank warfare, the Iran war is serving as the proving ground for artificial intelligence in live combat.
It's a massive shift.
We are talking about the U.S. military heavily utilizing Anthropic's Claude AI as a decision support system. But I have to stop here because when I think of Claude, I think of a large language model, like a chat bot that people use to draft emails or summarize PDFs. How exactly does a chatbot translate into a military targeting protocol?
Well, it requires a shift in how we understand what these AI models actually do. They are fundamentally supreme pattern recognition engines.
Okay, so they're digesting information.
Exactly. The reporting details how the military has adapted these models to ingest overwhelming amounts of battlefield data. Imagine thousands of text-based intelligence reports, logistics manifests, intercepted radio transcripts, and metadata from satellite imagery.
Stuff that would take a human analyst weeks to cross-reference to find a single vulnerability.
Right. But the AI can read, synthesize, and cross-reference millions of data points across all those different formats simultaneously. It can highlight an anomaly like, say, a sudden shift in enemy supply trucks and suggest a strike window in milliseconds. It's unprecedented speed and scale.
It's like transitioning from playing a slow, deliberate game of chess to playing a high-speed video game where a supercomputer is suggesting your next move in milliseconds.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the source notes that China is not far behind, actively prototyping AI capabilities to pilot unmanned combat vehicles and orchestrate automated cyber attacks.
Yes. And the historical echo here is profound. Smith draws a line back to the 1870s when the integration of railroads and mass artillery completely disrupted the European balance of power.
Right, allowing Germany to become a dominant force almost overnight.
Exactly. In the 1920s and 30s, the rapid development of air power and mechanized armor did the exact same thing. Whenever there's a massive lead in industrial or military technology, the global hierarchy becomes instantly obscured.
That obscures who actually holds the real power, which brings up a terrifying paradox. If leaders have this super smart AI telling them exactly where an enemy is vulnerable, does it actually make war more likely? Because it seems like it would give them a false sense of overconfidence.
What's fascinating here is that exact paradox. The source emphasizes that uncertain balances of power are scarier than known balances of power.
Because no one truly knows who the most powerful country is right now.
Precisely. During the Cold War, the U.S. and the Soviet Union generally understood each other's capabilities. That mutual understanding, grim as it was, created a twisted sort of stability.
Right, mutually assured destruction.
Right. But right now, no one truly knows who has the absolute upper hand. Is it the U.S. with its advanced AI integration, or is it China with its overwhelming mass production capabilities? When leaders don't know exactly where they stand on the global hierarchy, they're much more likely to roll the dice and test their strength.
They push the boundaries until they find resistance. And, the resistance to this current conflict isn't just happening on the battlefield. It's happening heavily on the home front. So what does this all mean? We just went from AI chatbots picking missile targets to the price of a gallon of gas at your local station dictating the end of a war.
It's quite a leap, isn't it?
Yeah. How exactly does oil inflation change the playbook?
We can trace that directly through the public perception data. According to the polling cited in the sources, the current military action involving Iran is highly unpopular in America, with 53% of registered voters explicitly opposing it.
Wow, over half. That lack of support is fascinating because it breaks the historical mold. Usually, when a nation enters a conflict, there is an immediate rally round the flag effect.
Right, the public generally unites behind the troops.
Yeah, at least for the initial phase. But we aren't seeing that at all here.
No, we are seeing a complete absence of that effect.
Hmm.
There has been significant opposition from the outset, particularly from independent voters. They make up a crucial voting bloc, and there is just a deep structural wariness regarding any further Middle Eastern entanglements.
And because of this intense polling pressure, the reporting indicates that President Trump is actively searching for an exit strategy, recently referring to the war as very complete.
Yes, that is the factual reporting on the administration's stance.
Hmm.
But it's not just an ideological opposition to war driving that exit strategy, it's wallet sentiment. The biggest driver is oil.
Because Iran recently set a crude oil tanker ablaze near Dubai.
Exactly. That single action immediately escalated fears of massive supply disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, which is arguably the most critical choke point for global oil transit.
And when the transit routes through the Strait of Hormuz are threatened, the global oil market reacts violently. Just the perceived risk alone is enough to cause crude prices to spike.
Yes, and when crude prices spike, the cost to transport goods skyrockets, and the price of a gallon of gas at your local station goes up.
Which is the exact mechanism that drives domestic inflation. And according to the sources, there is nothing that angers Americans more universally than high inflation.
Exactly. Geopolitics directly manipulates domestic inflation.
So the geopolitical instability threatens the oil supply threat spikes energy costs drive up inflation, and that inflation creates immense political pressure to end the war.
It is an inescapable feedback loop where foreign policy is ultimately dictated by domestic economic pain. But that inflation doesn't just put pressure on politicians. It fundamentally breaks traditional financial models.
Right.
Which brings us to the reporting from the Economic Times. It outlines a completely counterintuitive reaction in global markets.
This is the part of our deep dive that genuinely threw me. The great gold paradox of 2026. According to the financial reporting, despite an escalating war in the Middle East, and despite inflation fears surging at the pump, gold just experienced its worst monthly drop since October 2008.
A historic decline.
It plunged 13.3% in March alone, trading down around $4,572 an ounce. Wait a minute. Gold is the ultimate safe haven panic button for investors. If there's literally a war and inflation, people buy gold. Why is the financial rulebook suddenly being thrown out the window here?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to look closely at the nuanced difference between demand-driven inflation and supply-driven inflation.
Okay, lay that out for us.
Well, the inflation we're seeing right now is strictly supply-driven, caused by the geopolitical shock to the oil supply.
As opposed to demand-driven inflation, which happens when an economy is running too hot, employment is high, and people just have too much cash chasing too few goods.
Precisely. When central banks, like the Federal Reserve, see demand-driven inflation, they have a variety of tools to cool the economy. But when inflation is driven by a sudden supply shock in energy, something they have absolutely no control over, they are backed into a corner.
Right. They can't print more oil.
Exactly. Their only real option is to keep interest rates higher for a much longer period, to artificially suppress demand and try to balance out the lack of supply.
And those persistently high interest rates are the kryptonite for gold. Because if I'm an investor and the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates high, I can buy a U.S. Treasury bond and get a guaranteed high percentage yield just for holding on to it.
Exactly. You are earning a significant return on a virtually risk-free asset. Gold, on the other hand, yields absolutely nothing. It just sits in a vault.
Right. It doesn't pay a dividend.
The financial term for this is opportunity cost. When interest rates are high, the opportunity cost of holding a non-yielding asset like gold becomes incredibly steep. Investors abandon it for assets that actually pay them.
And furthermore, those high interest rates make the U.S. dollar exceptionally strong on the global stage. Because foreign investors want those high yields too, right?
Yes, they do.
So they have to buy U.S. dollars to purchase those treasury bonds, which drives the value of the dollar up. And since gold is globally priced in U.S. dollars, a strong dollar makes gold mathematically more expensive for anyone buying it with a foreign currency.
It acts like a massive gravitational pull, keeping global buyers away from gold in the short term. The traditional safe haven demand that should be triggered by the war is being completely overpowered by the macroeconomic reality of high interest rates and a dominant dollar.
So the war causes the oil shock causes supply-driven inflation, the inflation forces the Fed to hold rates high, the high rates strengthen the dollar, and the strong dollar crushes gold. That chain reaction makes perfect sense when you break it down.
It does.
But here is the twist from the Economic Times that we really need to unpack. Despite this brutal 13% drop, Goldman Sachs is looking at the board and saying they remain incredibly bullish. They are predicting that gold will completely rebound and hit $5,400 an ounce by the end of 2026.
Yeah, quite a bold prediction.
How do they justify predicting a massive rally right after a historic crash?
Because Goldman Sachs is looking past the immediate supply shock and focusing on the long-term structural fundamentals. They anticipate that the Federal Reserve will eventually be forced to cut rates. But more importantly, they are tracking the behavior of the absolute biggest whales in the financial markets.
The global central banks.
Exactly. While retail investors and standard portfolios are selling off gold because of the high opportunity cost, the central banks are quietly buying it. And not just a little bit. The source estimates they are hoarding around 60 tons of physical gold every single month.
Wow, 60 tons a month. That is a staggering amount of capital flowing into physical assets.
It is. Goldman's thesis is that everyday allocation to gold in Western investment portfolios is currently sitting at historic lows. Once the interest rate pressure finally eases and the opportunity cost drops, retail investors will need to diversify back into gold.
And that returning retail demand slamming into the massive ongoing demand from central banks will act like a coiled spring, driving the price upward to that $5,400 mark.
That's the bullish argument. But the source does present alternative scenarios depending on how the geopolitical dominoes fall.
Right. Like, if the conflict in the Middle East drags on much longer than anticipated and market stress builds to a breaking point, the exact same high interest rate dynamic we discussed could push gold down even further, potentially bottoming out at $3,800 an ounce.
Yeah, that is the worst-case scenario for gold bulls. A prolonged period of stagflation where high energy prices keep rates elevated indefinitely.
But on the flip side, there is an upside scenario that ties directly back to those central banks buying 60 tons a month. The report notes that if the trend of de-dollarization accelerates, meaning foreign nations actively taking steps to move away from using the US dollar for global trade gold, could skyrocket to $5,700 or even $6,100 an ounce.
And this is perhaps the most critical underlying theme of the global financial shift. Central banks are not hoarding 60 tons of gold a month simply as a standard inflation hedge. They are acquiring physical gold as a strategic geopolitical hedge against the dominance of the US dollar and the vulnerability of the Western financial system.
Which brings us to the end of the line, connecting all of our sources into one cohesive picture. We started with the concept of the Iran war acting as the foothills of a larger conflict, testing new, hardened alliances and previewing how artificial intelligence will fundamentally change the speed and calculation of warfare.
Right.
We traced how that battlefield technology threatens the physical choke points of global oil, resulting in a severe supply shock. That supply shock forces domestic inflation up, which creates immense political pressure on the administration to find an exit strategy, while simultaneously forcing the Federal Reserve to hold interest rates high.
A massive ripple effect.
And it was those persistently high interest rates that ultimately caused a historic crash in the price of gold, even as global central banks quietly accumulate it at a record pace.
It perfectly illustrates why looking at these events in isolation is so dangerous. Being truly informed today requires understanding the mechanics of these interconnected systems.
Yeah.
I mean, you cannot comprehend the drop in your gold ETF without understanding the targeting algorithms being tested in the Middle East.
You have to see the whole board. Which leaves me with one final provocative thought for you to mull over. We have AI rapidly becoming the hyper-fast, invisible digital weapon of modern war. Simultaneously, we have global central banks hoarding physical analog gold and pushing toward de-dollarization. It makes you wonder, are the world's superpowers quietly preparing for a future where digital infrastructure, AI-driven networks, and even digital fiat currencies can simply no longer be trusted in a global conflict? Are they stockpiling the only true analog asset left before the digital grid becomes a battlefield? I'll leave you to ponder that on your own.
Man, that is an incredibly sobering question to consider as these technologies continue to mature.
Until next time, remember to look past the isolated headlines. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.